Winter's End, tucked between misty hills and bound by a stretch of woodland, always had an air of quiet mystery, as though every shadow held a secret. The townsfolk moved with a curious restraint, their eyes glancing towards the hill that rose to the north, as if acknowledging something invisible but deeply felt. It was here, at the cusp of October's end, that the townspeople would hunker down in their homes, whispering a collective silence that hung thick in the air on the night before Halloween. Marianne was amused by the tradition called the Vigil of the Hill. Newly arrived from the city to teach history at the local high school, she found herself regarded with an odd respect mixed with apprehension, as if her youth and newness could somehow disrupt the fragile balance Winter's End had carefully preserved. The town had its charms: brick streets, tangled trees that reached towards the slate sky, a crisp air that felt brimming with the unseen. But these stories of ancient customs and nocturnal watchmen? Well, they were little more than local legends meant to amuse and frighten. She heard about the vigil when her neighbor, Mrs. Halcombe, an older woman with a face creased by time, spoke of it in a low voice one evening. The Halloween Eve ritual, Mrs. Halcombe explained, was the town's most enduring tradition. On the night of October 30th, families locked themselves indoors, draped windows with blankets, and left only the faintest glimmers of light. Marianne listened with a smile tugging at her lips. "So, what happens if someone decides to go out?" she asked, the words almost a challenge, daring this hidden town to reveal something real. Mrs. Halcombe had given her a look both startled and troubled. "No one would dare." "Something walks here," she murmured. "It doesn't like to be denied. If it comes to your door, it means you have something it wants." That night, as the last sun of October 30th dipped behind the hills, Marianne looked out her window at the empty street. A faint breeze scattered the dried leaves, scraping them along the cobblestones with a sound like ghostly whispers. The town had grown still, cloaked in a silence deeper than any she had known, the lights in every house gone, leaving an eerie, pale glow from the sky. Her gaze traveled up the hill, where she could see only shadows and the occasional flicker of movement that may have been her imagination. With a strange thrill, she decided she'd stay up and see. She pulled a chair close to the window, her gaze fixed on the hill, feeling the isolation press in as the silence seemed to thicken with each passing hour. Midnight crept closer, and with it, a feeling of expectation she couldn't quite explain. She poured herself a cup of tea, feeling both defiant and a touch apprehensive, ready to see the superstition dispelled. Then, as the clock struck 12, a figure appeared on the crest of the hill. It stood tall, cloaked in shadow, a hood obscuring its face. Its presence struck her with an intensity she hadn't anticipated, a weight, as if it carried with it all the history and secrets of Winter's End. She watched, transfixed, as it began to descend the hill, each step slow, deliberate, like a ritual unfolding. The figure seemed to gather the darkness around it, shadows twisting in its wake as if it was breathing life into them. Marianne felt a chill run through her. It stopped in front of her house, lifting its head as though it could see her through the glass. The wind fell utterly silent, and the figure remained still, waiting. She felt an inexplicable pull to the door, almost as if guided by a force outside herself. Her hand hovered above the latch. A voice, low and resonant, whispered from beyond the door, "I'm waiting." The weight of the whisper hung in the air long after it had faded, settling into the walls, seeping into her mind, stirring a primal dread Marianne had never known. She stood there, her hand still inches from the latch, staring at the door as if expecting it to open of its own accord. Every fiber of her being told her to back away, to return to the safety of her room, but she felt rooted to the spot, ensnared by a curiosity that had already drawn her too close. Outside, the figure stood unmoving, a silent sentinel cloaked in the mist that gathered at its feet. The house was filled with a stillness so complete it felt unnatural. Each tick of the old clock in the hall sounded like an invitation, as though urging her to make a choice. The words had been simple, yet they held a promise laced with a quiet menace that seemed tailored just for her. Without thinking, she stepped back from the door, her hand falling to her side. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though it had sensed her retreat, and Marianne felt an inexplicable pang of guilt, as though she were a child who had failed a test of courage. The pull to open the door was still there, lingering like a scent in the air, but she forced herself to turn away, her heartbeat thundering in her ears as she made her way back to the window. From there, she could see the figure still waiting at her doorstep, shadowed by the night's darkness. The air felt heavier, pressing in around her, and a strange silence had fallen over Winter's End. It was as if the entire town held its breath, as if waiting to see what she would do. The figure's stillness grew almost unbearable, a pointed accusation aimed squarely at her cowardice. "Foolishness," she muttered, more to convince herself than anything else. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, willing herself to dismiss the strange visitor as nothing more than a prankster, a local, perhaps, indulging in the town's peculiar Halloween Eve ritual. After all, it would make sense for someone to test the resolve of newcomers who mocked their superstitions. But then the figure moved. Slowly, it lifted a hand, pale and slender, extending a single finger that pointed toward her window. The gesture was unsettlingly direct, like an accusation, a silent reminder that she had chosen not to invite it in. She felt her skin prickle as if brushed by a cold wind, though the air in the room was still. The gesture was not angry or demanding but deliberate, as though it were marking her as something it would not forget. Marianne took a step back, her spine pressing against the wall, her eyes wide as the figure finally lowered its hand, turning away from her house. A sense of reprieve washed over her, but it was hollow, as if this encounter was merely the beginning of something that would stretch beyond the night, weaving its way into her life like a slowly tightening thread. She watched as the figure drifted down the empty street, its form blurring and reshaping as it moved, like smoke in the air, before disappearing into the darkness. She could breathe again, but the breath was shaky. She felt relief, but it was tainted by the unnerving sense that she had been marked in some way, as if she'd left a door half open without knowing it. Her relief was tinged with a nagging doubt, a sense that she'd allowed something into her life by simply observing. Morning crept over Winter's End slowly, the fog refusing to lift, leaving the town blanketed in a chill that seeped into her bones. By the time Marianne dared to leave her house, the streets were deserted, marked only by scattered leaves that seemed frozen in place, as though even the wind was hesitant to disrupt the scene. It wasn't until she reached the center of town that she realized just how deeply the vigil of the hill had etched itself into the people here. The faces that greeted her were weary, shadowed, but no one asked about her night. Instead, they regarded her with an air of grim expectancy, as though they were waiting to see what her encounter would yield. At the edge of the square, Mrs. Halcombe was sweeping her porch, her broom moving in slow, deliberate strokes that suggested she was trying to sweep away more than just dust. She met Marianne's eyes briefly, then looked away, a flicker of something unsaid passing between them. Marianne wanted to ask, wanted to speak of the figure, the whisper, the strange, undeniable presence that still lingered in her mind, but she held her tongue. Instinct told her that speaking of it would give it weight, make it more real. But as she walked home, Marianne couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As the days passed, Winter's End began to feel less like a town and more like a stage, where each resident moved in practiced silence, careful not to stir the unseen. Conversations became short, glances brief, and laughter, a rarity, when it came, had a strained, brittle quality, as though no one dared to show too much cheer in the town's creeping autumnal gloom. Marianne found herself replaying that night, obsessing over the figure's silent approach and that whispered invitation that felt as though it had burrowed into her memory. She could recall with disturbing clarity the way its slender hand had pointed toward her, a gesture that still left her chilled. No one in town spoke of the vigil of the hill afterward, nor did they seem interested in asking if she had joined in, as they put it. Instead, each neighbor now seemed to regard her with a peculiar blend of unease and pity, as though she were a patient with an invisible affliction, one that would only worsen over time. One afternoon, as Marianne returned from the grocer's, she passed by the hill at the edge of town, the one the townsfolk avoided even during the brightest of days. Her feet slowed, her gaze drawn to the crest of the hill, where the trees loomed like dark guardians over a hidden secret. There was nothing especially eerie about it in the daylight, yet the sight of it tugged at her with a force she couldn't ignore. As she gazed, her neighbor, a frail man named Walter Griggs, approached with a soft shuffle, his gaze fixed firmly on the ground. She nodded politely, expecting nothing more than the usual murmured greeting, but Walter surprised her by stopping beside her, his eyes darting nervously to the hill. "You looked," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Marianne turned to him, caught off guard by his words. She searched his face for any sign of mockery, but all she found was a deep, profound weariness. "What do you mean, Mr. Griggs?" she asked, forcing a lightness into her tone. He glanced around as though worried someone might overhear, and then, after a tense pause, he spoke in a voice tinged with regret. "We told you to stay inside, to keep the curtains drawn. We don't take kindly to curiosity here. Not on that night." His words were strange, but his tone was heavy, weighted with something she couldn't quite name. Was it fear, or perhaps something closer to mourning? Marianne managed a weak smile. "I thought it was just a tradition, some old folk tale." "Tradition is for the living, Miss Blake," he interrupted, his gaze darkening. "What walks on the hill does not belong to us, not anymore. It seeks out those who do not heed the warnings. There are no second chances." A chill rippled through her, but she pushed it down, clinging to her skepticism. "And if I did look? What happens then?" Walter's shoulders sagged, and he exhaled slowly, as though her question had confirmed something he'd feared. He lowered his voice, his words slipping out like secrets he wished he could hold back. "You invited it, Miss Blake. You gave it notice. It doesn't forget." Marianne opened her mouth to laugh, to brush off his words with some light-hearted remark, but the expression on his face silenced her. His eyes were dull, burdened with an unspoken sorrow, as though he had seen the consequences of such invitations before. She shook her head, more for herself than for him. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not haunted. I'm just a newcomer, maybe a bit too curious. But I'm fine." She forced a reassuring smile, trying to make herself believe it as much as him. "Honestly." But Walter only pressed his lips together, nodding in a way that suggested he'd heard it all before. "It may not be tonight, or tomorrow night. But it will come, Miss Blake. There are those it doesn't let go of. And if you look again, if you seek it out, don't expect anyone here to help." With that, he shuffled away, leaving her alone on the path by the hill. His words echoed in her mind, mingling with the memory of the figure's outstretched hand and that whisper that seemed to live inside her now, repeating itself when she least expected it. "I'm waiting." The next few nights were sleepless ones. She felt as though the quiet had a pulse, as though her very house was breathing with a strange, subtle rhythm that she couldn't ignore. She took to pacing by her window, feeling drawn to the hill even in her reluctance. Shadows seemed to move on the streets with newfound intention, gathering under lampposts and lingering by doorways. One evening, as she passed by the mirror in her hallway, she caught a glimpse of something, a figure in the glass, pale and shrouded in shadow, staring back at her with an intensity that felt like a recognition. But when she spun around, there was nothing behind her but the quiet, empty hall. It was the small things, too, the way her breath misted even inside her home, the way her radio crackled with static when she tried to tune into the local station. Her reflection began to appear strange, unfamiliar, as though her own face were watching her with a cautionary glint in its eye. The sense of being marked, of having welcomed something unknowable, was no longer a vague impression but an undeniable weight pressing down on her, day by day. One evening, against her better judgment, Marianne allowed herself a single indulgence. She went to her window, drawing back the curtain just an inch, just enough to see the edge of the hill, half shrouded in the evening mist. Her heart was a fluttering, nervous thing, yet she felt compelled, as though answering a call she couldn't ignore. And there it was, standing at the crest of the hill, silent, waiting. A figure cloaked in shadows, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. Marianne felt her breath catch as it raised its hand once more, the pale fingers extending toward her window with a slow, deliberate motion. Only this time, it did not wait for her invitation. In the following days, Marianne grew quieter, her once bright spirit dimming as a persistent chill settled into her bones. She could not shake the feeling that something was watching her from every corner, every shadowed space in her home. It was as though she had opened a door that was never meant to be touched, and now, whatever lingered on the other side was creeping through the threshold, its presence weaving into the fabric of her life. Her students at the small school noticed the change in her. Once an energetic, thoughtful teacher, she now moved through the classroom with a distracted air, her eyes darting to the windows as if searching for something only she could see. The children whispered among themselves, passing nervous glances her way, and she overheard fragments of their conversations, rumors about the vigil of the hill, about ghosts and warnings. One child, a shy girl with wide, solemn eyes, tugged at Marianne's sleeve one morning. "Miss Blake," the girl whispered, her voice as soft as a breath. "Did you see it?" Marianne felt a chill run through her. She looked down at the child, forcing a gentle smile. "See what, Clara?" "The one who waits," the girl replied, her small hand still clutching Marianne's sleeve. "My grandma says he finds the ones who aren't careful. She says he marks them." Marianne's forced smile faltered. She gently pried the girl's hand from her arm, her pulse thudding in her ears. "Now, Clara, that's just a story," she replied, her voice as steady as she could manage. "Nothing to be afraid of." But the girl only stared at her, a knowing sadness in her gaze that made Marianne shudder. As the school day wore on, Marianne found herself replaying the child's words, her own denials fading into a creeping certainty. The figure on the hill, the icy breath on her neck, the lingering shadows, they weren't the imaginings of an overly curious mind. Whatever she had glimpsed that night was real as the chill that had begun to settle into her house, seeping from the floorboards and curling up her spine. That evening, Marianne sat alone in her living room, her house unusually quiet. She tried to distract herself with a book, but the words blurred as her mind drifted back to that night. In the silence, the creaks and groans of the old house seemed to amplify, each sound whispering to her, drawing her thoughts back to the figure on the hill. And then, a soft tap echoed from her front door. Marianne froze, her breath hitching as the sound repeated, delicate yet persistent, like the gentle rapping of a branch against a window. Her eyes darted to the door, her heartbeat a frantic drum in her chest. She was alone, and the street outside lay empty under the thick blanket of night. There was no reason for anyone to be knocking. The tapping grew louder, a steady rhythm that filled the room, and she felt her hand trembling as she reached for the edge of her chair, anchoring herself. Against her better judgment, she stood, moving toward the door with slow, deliberate steps. The sound became louder, sharper, as though whoever, or whatever, was on the other side had grown impatient. "Who's there?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. The words echoed back at her, swallowed by the silence. And then, for a moment, the tapping stopped. She felt a surge of relief, only for it to vanish as a soft, familiar voice drifted from the other side of the door. "I'm waiting." It was the same voice she had heard that night, the same low whisper that had slipped through the cracks of her home, rooting itself in her memory. She staggered back, her hand pressed to her mouth, the icy weight of fear settling into her stomach. She wanted to scream, to flee, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The handle of the door rattled, as if something, or someone, were testing it, and Marianne could swear she felt the cold seeping through the door, creeping toward her like fingers of frost. Her mind raced, every rational thought dissolving into panic. She had been warned, she had been told to leave well enough alone, and yet, her curiosity had led her here, to this very moment. Her gaze drifted to the small window beside the door, and without thinking, she took a step closer, peering out into the darkened street. Her heart stopped as she saw it, a figure standing just beyond her door, its outline hazy in the dim light, cloaked in shadows that seemed to writhe and twist around it. The hood obscured its face, but she could feel its gaze piercing through her, cold and unyielding. As her eyes met the figure's, a wave of dread washed over her, so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. She felt it again, the silent invitation, the pull that urged her to open the door, to step outside and join whatever waited beyond. Her hand trembled as it hovered over the lock, a war raging within her as the voice echoed in her mind, repeating the words over and over, as if binding her to its will. "I'm waiting." In a last, desperate act of defiance, she backed away from the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stumbled into the living room, her eyes wide and unblinking, and collapsed onto the sofa, pressing her hands over her ears to drown out the voice. She couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize the terror that coursed through her veins. All she knew was that whatever lay outside her door was patient, and it wouldn't leave until it was invited. And so she sat, curled up in the darkness, the hours ticking by in a slow, agonizing silence as she waited for the first light of dawn to break over winter's end. When the morning finally came, she dared to approach the door, half expecting to find the figure still standing there, waiting for her. But as she peered through the window, she saw nothing, only the empty street, blanketed in fallen leaves and the pale, fragile light of morning. Her relief was short-lived, however, as her eyes drifted downward, landing on something small and pale lying just outside her door. A single white feather, glistening with a faint sheen of frost. Marianne spent the next day in a daze, the sight of that single, frost-covered feather looping through her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't shake. She wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in a drawer, telling herself it was just a feather, a peculiar find, nothing more. But the memory of that figure, shrouded in shadows and bathed in cold, unnatural silence, lingered with a weight she couldn't dismiss. Every creak in her home, every sigh of the autumn wind seemed to carry whispers just beyond her hearing. By evening, Marianne's nerves felt raw, worn thin by her own looping thoughts. She tried to rationalize the events of the past nights, to mold them into something mundane, something that could be explained away. She made herself tea, recited calming mantras, anything to coax herself into calmness. Yet, as the shadows deepened outside her window and the streetlights flickered on, she felt that same prickling unease, that intangible sense of being observed. And as the clock approached midnight, she felt an undeniable pull toward the feather, sitting quietly in her drawer like a relic from some ancient mystery. Unable to resist, she opened the drawer and retrieved it, the feather's icy touch sending a shiver through her fingers. She traced its edge, feeling the cool texture beneath her thumb, and closed her eyes. She had to know what it meant. She needed answers. The townsfolk in their fearful glances wouldn't give her anything useful. She had already tried. There was no one left to ask but herself, and the silent figure she had glimpsed, looming in her memory with an insistent patience. She spent that night in restless vigil, staring at the feather, her pulse loud in her ears. But nothing happened. No sound at her door, no chilling whisper, nothing but the silence pressing in around her. Exhausted, she fell into a fitful sleep as the sky outside began to lighten, feeling a hollow ache of disappointment mingled with dread. The next morning, her neighbors' pitying glances seemed even sharper, the weight of their unspoken thoughts growing heavier. When she tried to engage Mrs. Morris next door, who was known for gossip, she received only a wary smile and a hasty exit, as though Marianne carried some untouchable aura. That evening, as the last hues of daylight faded, Marianne resolved to return to the hill, the very place she had watched the figure emerge. She wrapped herself in a thick coat and set off along the quiet road leading out of town. The trees loomed on either side like silent sentries, their branches clawing at the darkening sky. Her steps were loud against the brittle leaves carpeting the ground, and with each step, the air grew colder, more oppressive, until she could see her breath misting before her. At the base of the hill, she hesitated, staring up the path to where the figure had stood that night. The summit seemed further than she remembered, shrouded in a hazy mist that softened the moonlight into a ghostly glow. She felt a pang of fear but pushed forward, climbing the hill with determined steps. As she neared the top, the wind stilled, and an uncanny silence blanketed the air, thick and almost tangible. Then she saw it. There, at the peak, a solitary figure stood, its form blurred by the mist, as if the shadows clung to it like smoke. Marianne's heart thundered, but something within her urged her closer, drawn by a pull she could neither explain nor resist. She stepped forward, her breath shallow and careful, until she stood only a few paces away from the figure. The figure did not move. It stood, shrouded in its dark, flowing cloak, the edges dissolving into the mist. She tried to glimpse a face beneath the hood, but the shadows clung to it stubbornly, concealing whatever lay beneath. Yet she could feel its gaze, cool and weighty, resting on her with a detached, almost expectant curiosity. Finally, she spoke, her voice thin and trembling in the silence. "Why are you here?" she asked, her words swallowed by the stillness. "What do you want?" For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, from beneath the hood, a whisper, like dry leaves rustling over stone. "I am here because you asked," it replied, the voice familiar, echoing with the same tone she had heard outside her door. "You opened a door, Marianne. And now, it cannot be closed." Marianne felt a cold shiver slide down her spine. She hadn't asked anything of it, she hadn't invited it. But the figure's gaze was unrelenting, as if peeling back layers of her soul, revealing her curiosity, her defiance, and the small, unspoken invitation she had extended the moment she watched it from her window. "Who are you?" she whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. The figure tilted its head, almost in amusement. "I am whatever you made me," it murmured. "Whatever lies in your shadows." The words lingered, wrapping around her like a fog. She felt herself swaying, as though tethered to something beyond her control. Every moment she remained on the hill, she felt a part of herself slipping away, dissolving into the mist around her. Desperate, she stumbled back, breaking whatever spell had drawn her in. She turned and ran, her footsteps frantic as she scrambled down the hill, the figure's words echoing in her mind like a distant chant. She could still feel its gaze, trailing after her, a reminder of the invitation she had unwittingly extended. When she reached her home, She bolted the door behind her, locking out the chill and the shadows, clutching the feather in her hand as if it were her only anchor. But even in the safety of her home, she felt its presence lingering in the corners of her mind, patient and silent, waiting. As the dawn broke over winter's end, Marianne knew that whatever door she had opened could not be so easily shut. Days passed, and winter's end began its usual preparations for Halloween. Banners appeared in shop windows, pumpkins adorned the steps of nearly every home, and the air grew thick with the scent of dried leaves and damp earth. Children played in the streets, clad in early costumes, their laughter bright against the deepening autumn chill. But for Marianne, each sight and sound felt distant, as if she were watching it all through a pane of glass, removed from the joy and light-heartedness of the season. Her nights had grown restless, her sleep broken by strange dreams of shadowy figures and barren hills. She could not shake the memory of the figure on the hilltop, its words wrapping around her thoughts with an icy grip. She found herself avoiding mirrors, catching glimpses of movements just out of sight in their darkened corners. Once, she thought she saw a figure reflected over her shoulder, standing at the far end of the hall, and nearly called out before the shadow slipped away, leaving her alone with the silence. Determined to break free from whatever strange hold winter's end had over her, Marianne decided to leave her home and spend a day out in the town, mingling with the other residents. She wandered into the general store, where she was met with curious looks from the townsfolk, their gazes lingering just a moment too long. They whispered to each other as she passed, their eyes widening slightly, as if she were carrying some invisible mark. At the counter, she tried to engage Mrs. Clayton, the store's owner, in conversation, hoping for some normalcy. But the woman's face was tight with worry, her hands fidgeting as she avoided Marianne's eyes. "You ought to be careful tonight, dear," Mrs. Clayton murmured finally, her voice barely audible. "It's not wise to wander on the eve of Halloween." Marianne tried to laugh it off. "Is that just another one of winter's end's little traditions?" she asked, forcing a lightness into her tone. "I'm still getting used to all the peculiar customs." But Mrs. Clayton's expression remained grave. "It's more than that. The night before Halloween is when it comes closest. That's why we stay inside, keep to ourselves, lock every door. There are things that move in the dark, things that we shouldn't invite in." Marianne felt a chill prickle across her skin, Mrs. Clayton's words resonating with the figure's haunting whisper on the hill. "You opened a door, Marianne. And now, it cannot be closed." She left the store quickly, her thoughts tangled and heavy. Every instinct told her to leave winter's end, to abandon her small house and seek safety elsewhere. But something held her back, a strange, inexplicable pull that anchored her to this place. She wanted answers. More than anything, she needed to understand what she had glimpsed on the hill, to face the fear that had settled in her bones. As the evening approached, the streets grew quiet, the cheerful Halloween decorations now seeming to cast eerie shadows across the town. Windows darkened as families shuttered their homes, the faint glow of candles flickering through drawn curtains. She could feel the weight of the town's silence pressing down, thick and suffocating, as though the very air were filled with an unspoken dread. Marianne spent the evening pacing her home, unable to settle her thoughts. She lit candles, filling her living room with their soft glow, hoping their warmth would stave off the creeping chill. But as midnight approached, she felt that familiar pull, a cold whispering at the edges of her mind, beckoning her to the window. When the clock struck 12, she drew back the curtain and peered outside. The streets were empty, the silence profound. But as she watched, a shadow emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint moonlight that spilled across her yard. It was the figure. It stood there, still as stone, its face hidden beneath the same dark hood, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Marianne felt her breath hitch, her fingers cold against the window pane. She could feel its gaze again, piercing through her, reaching into the recesses of her mind, stirring a fear that rooted her in place. Slowly, it raised one hand, gesturing to the door with a deliberate, almost graceful movement. The invitation was unmistakable, and despite the warning whispers that filled her thoughts, Marianne felt herself drawn to it, the pull stronger than ever. She moved toward the door, her steps slow and hesitant, as if something within her were fighting against her very will. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting into her skin. She felt a shiver run through her, the air around her thickening, pressing in like a heavy, invisible force. She hesitated, her heart pounding, her mind screaming to turn back. But her fingers tightened around the doorknob, the call of the figure too powerful to resist. Just as she began to turn the handle, a sudden noise broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the window behind her. She froze, the sound reverberating through the quiet, like a warning, a reminder of something just beyond her understanding. She turned slowly, her gaze drawn to the window, and found herself staring into her own reflection, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. In the faint light, she saw a second figure standing just behind her reflection, a shape shrouded in darkness, its outline blurred and indistinct, as though it were part of the shadows themselves. The tapping continued, each beat echoing like a heartbeat, pulling her gaze deeper into the reflection. The figure in the window moved, lifting a hand to mirror her own, its fingers long and thin, reaching out as if to touch her through the glass. She took a step back, her heart racing, but the figure remained, its hand pressed against the window, its face obscured in shadows. And then, it spoke, its voice a faint whisper, almost indistinguishable from the sound of the wind outside. "Let me in." The words sent a chill through her, freezing her to the spot, her mind racing with fear and confusion. She turned back to the door, but the figure outside had vanished, leaving only the quiet, empty street bathed in moonlight. Marianne felt herself shudder, the echo of the words lingering in her mind, twisting into something both familiar and foreign. She backed away from the door, the sense of dread thickening around her, and as she retreated into the safety of her home, she felt the invisible weight of the invitation she had unknowingly extended, a bond that could not be severed, a door that could never be truly closed. The following morning dawned gray and silent, a thick mist clinging to the town of Winter's End like a ghostly veil. Marianne woke with a start, her sleep troubled by memories of shadows pressing in, whispers that drifted in and out of her dreams. She stumbled to her window, almost hoping she'd imagined everything. But as she gazed out, the street lay deserted, silent, as if the entire town were holding its breath. Feeling a deep unease, she dressed quickly and headed outside, hoping that the cool air would help clear her head. The town's residents moved with a cautious, subdued air, casting furtive glances at the empty hilltop. And though she'd become used to feeling like an outsider, Marianne felt a marked distance today, a sense that the people of Winter's End regarded her with something more than suspicion. They wouldn't meet her gaze, their faces carefully turned away, the kind of detachment reserved for those who had crossed some invisible line. As she passed the general store, Mrs. Clayton stepped out, holding a broom. The old woman paused, her face drawn, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at Marianne with something approaching pity. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marianne nodded slowly, unsure what to say. She felt a hollow ache in her chest, a lingering echo of last night's events, as if she'd opened herself to something she could neither understand nor control. Mrs. Clayton's gaze softened with a strange sadness. "Once you've seen it, there's no going back," she said quietly. "There's a reason we stay inside. Every year, we keep it at bay, offering it nothing, granting it no invitation." The words struck her with a cold clarity, and a realization settled in her heart with terrifying finality. Last night, she had offered more than a passing glance. She had extended an invitation, had touched the door, had listened to the voice on the other side. And someone had answered. Marianne felt the weight of the townsfolk's stares, their silent judgment lingering like a shadow over her. Her footsteps carried her away from the store and up the narrow path to her home. She wanted to be alone, to wrap herself in silence, but she couldn't escape the feeling that her house was different now, altered in some undefinable way, as though it bore a permanent mark from her actions the night before. As she entered, her gaze fell to the doorway, and her breath caught. There, etched faintly into the wood near the handle, were words, as if someone had carved them in haste, their presence barely visible in the pale morning light. She knelt, tracing the letters with a trembling finger. "I will return." The words were stark, simple, yet they carried a depth of meaning that chilled her to the core. She could almost hear the whispering echo of last night's voice, lingering just beyond the doorway, hovering in the shadows. Marianne pulled her hand back, a wave of nausea rolling through her. She knew she could not stay in Winter's End. Whatever ancient pact the townsfolk honored, whatever shadowed being roamed freely one night each year, she had crossed a threshold. And something had accepted her invitation. That evening, she packed a small suitcase, her hands shaking as she moved through her home, aware of how every creak and whisper seemed to watch her, as though the house itself were waiting to see if she'd follow through. By dusk, she was gone, leaving the town of Winter's End and the chill that clung to it. Years passed, and she managed to convince herself that what had happened in Winter's End was little more than a strange, unsettling memory, a story she had woven too deeply into her mind. But every October 30th, without fail, she'd feel a familiar cold creeping in, a chill that seeped under her door no matter where she moved, no matter how many miles lay between her and that quiet town. And every year, she would find a faint trace, a barely perceptible message, scrawled somewhere in her home, a reminder from whatever had followed her out of Winter's End. "Are you ready to let me in?" The words would be different each time, the question changing but the meaning unmistakable. And on one silent, still night many years later, after yet another long October, Marianne found herself standing by her front door, her hand hovering over the handle. She stared at the faint imprint of those words, and she wondered just how long she could keep the door closed. As she turned away, she could have sworn she heard the familiar voice, distant yet unmistakable, waiting patiently in the shadows beyond. "I will return,"